Ladles and jelly spoons, welcome back to Badgerworks. Today, this. This is the Messerschmidt ME262A-1A from Airfix in 1/72 scale. This is the new one, or the new model. I mean, I don't know if you can see that very well, but on there it says Model Design and Tooling 2017. So this is the new one. So I have high hopes for this.
Right in the middle of it all.
Yep.
Good. That's what we like to see.
I'm going to edit all that out anyway.
Okay. Good.
Right then. So yes, I have quite high hopes for this. Now, again, we're going to do something a little bit different with this. I don't know if you watched the Curtis Tomahawk Red 5 video. But this, as you may have already guessed, is going to be representative of the Empire. So specifically, this is representing Darth Vader's TIE Fighter. That's the idea behind it. Which does actually present some challenges. But the main one of which being that Empire aircraft, spacecraft, are very monochromatic. They are basically just grey with black bits. I don't know whether they're solar panels or heat sinks or whatever. Anyway, but they're primarily grey. And so what we want to try and do is have it a uniform grey without it looking too kind of monochromatic. We don't just want a grey blob. Obviously with the Tomahawk, you know, that was a rebel aircraft. It was, you know, held together with split and baling wire. It was filthy dirty, so there's lots of weathering involved. This Empire aircraft, all very well maintained, very clean and shiny, very nice. So that will give us some interesting challenges on the paint. But let's have a look at the model and see what it looks like. Right, so instructions, fairly standard for Airfix. As I say, for the non-starter kits, because this isn't a starter kit, there's more colour on the instructions, which is kind of interesting because I like the way they do it. They show you, like, attach this bit, and then in the next picture they show you that was the last bit you attached, now attach this bit. So I quite like that. So it is fairly idiot proof. This one actually has all the paint scheme on it, which, if you remember from the Tomahawk, it had some very strange instructions, but this seems a lot more kind of normal, shall we say. Bit of blurb on the front as usual. Again, the 262 being the first operational jet fighter. So yeah, that's all good. The other thing this includes is a quite nice painting schematic for the two colour schemes that come with the kit. It's quite nice again that it's all in colour, so it's a lot easier to see. It shows you all the decal placements and whatnot. Obviously we won't be using the decals that come with the kit. Might use a couple of them, but probably not very many. But we'll see. So there's that. And speaking of said decals, I doubt we're going to use very many. Well, I mean, we might use some of these, the stencils, because again, because this is going to be quite monochromatic, I think little details like that might actually work quite well, but we'll see how it goes. But the unit markings we won't be using, the crosses we won't be using. I have actually printed out some decals for this one again, so you'll see those later. So that's all good. Right, now the model itself, if I can get it out of this bag. As usual, the second plastic bag for the clear parts. Yeah, whatever. Let's get rid of that. Now, let's have a look. What have we got here? Yeah, it actually looks quite nice, which you would kind of expect being such a new kit. I mean, I say this is a 2017 copyright, so the molds are quite new. Not seeing a massive amount of mould lines, although there are some on the pilot, which is annoying because they're always a sod to clean up, but never mind. Because again, we will be putting the pilot in this one because he needs to represent Darth Vader. But yeah, it all looks pretty good. So let's start putting it together. Right, before we get started, something's just occurred to me. I actually have a number of these Revel Easy Click Star Wars vehicles. You've seen me make these before. And obviously this one is Darth Vader's TIE Fighter. So I thought, well, I wonder if the Darth Vader pilot figure will actually fit. It is a different scale. These are 1/121st scale, so it is a smaller scale, but they actually don't look that different in size. I mean, obviously Darth Vader is a very tall chap in real life, so I think this might actually work. So I think I'm going to try and see if I can get him to fit, rather than using the pilot figure that came with it. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. We'll give it a go. Right, so we'll start as we normally do with the cockpit. This model actually, for the most part, goes together quite well. There are a few little bits that were tricky, but on the whole, it's pretty good. The cockpit is fairly straightforward. It's quite an interesting shape, actually. It's like a bathtub, but then I know some modern aircraft have cockpits like this for the armour and whatnot. But anyway, yeah, so cockpit goes together fairly simply, apart from me keep dropping bits like I normally do. So what I'm going to do while this is drying is start to have a look at the pilot, the Darth Vader figure. Right, so here's our Darth Vader figure. Obviously we're going to have to modify him to make him fit. So I think what I'm going to have to do is remove the cloak from kind of between his legs, or basically the lower part of the cloak in general, and then cut the backs of his knees to straighten his legs out so that they fit, and also get rid of some of these awful mould lines on his helmet because they look absolutely awful. But anyway, let's cut him up and see what he looks like. So here he is, freshly butchered. And now he actually fits in there pretty much perfectly. I'm really pleased with how this has come out. So I'll just kind of tidy him up a bit and reinforce his legs a little bit, and then we can get on with painting the cockpit. That's the next step. So for the cockpit, I chose this XF63 German grey. It seemed like a suitably grey colour for the cockpit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this cockpit, the same as I did with the Curtis, because quite frankly, once it's together, you can barely see inside it. So really, this is just to, you know, give it a bit of colour while we put it together. This one does actually have a more of a cockpit view than the others, because it has a larger canopy. Anyway, once the grey's dry, we'll give it a coat of clear, just so that we can put the decal on. For the control panel. Now I'm actually just cutting here. You can see I'm just very closely following the inside line of this particular decal, because it has to fit very, very closely around a raised part of the instrument panel, and sometimes you get a little bit of not overspray, but you know, there's a little bit left over on the decal, and it makes them not sit properly. So it's always worth, with little decals like this, just giving them a trim around the edge to make them fit properly. So this goes on. We'll talk about the decal fitting a little bit more detail later, but this is just to show you that obviously this needs to go on at this point. And then obviously there's the other bit that goes on, which is for the top part of the panel. So these go on, let them dry for a bit, give them another coat of varnish to seal them in place, and once that's dry, we can start putting the cockpit together. So yeah, it's a fairly basic cockpit, but it does the job. So this is Mr. Vader going in. He's going to get stuck in place, and then we can put the rest of the or the top half of the cockpit on, and get it all together. So he actually looks pretty good in there. I gave him a little bit of gloss varnish on his helmet and things like that, just to, you know, make him a little bit more realistic looking, as it were, to make his helmet shiny and whatnot. So there we go. Now it's a case of assembling the lower wing assembly. This is quite a lot of Airfix kits seem to be doing this at the moment, which is you basically assemble the cockpit onto the lower wing and then fit the fuselage over the top, which I actually quite like that. I think it's quite a good idea. It certainly makes assembling the cockpit a lot easier, but you know, it is what it is. So yeah, this is the cockpit going in, and then while that's drying, we can make a start on the fuselage. And speaking of the fuselage, this is the two halves of it going together. I've mentioned this in previous videos, but it's always a good idea to assemble the fuselage in sections. So basically pick a point and kind of work your way around in a circle, as it were. It makes it a lot easier to sort of line everything up and get all the pieces together before you try and fit it all together, because sometimes if you just try and sort of mash the two halves together, you can end up with all kinds of fitment problems, which is not fun. But yeah, so this is quite a good idea. And then cleaning up the seam lines, which unfortunately seem inevitable on most kits these days, but it's not the end of the world. Just give them a quick rub down with a knife to get the worst of it off. And then there's a nice little trick to tidy them up even more, which I'll show you in a second, which is the old favourite of mine, the Mr. Dissolved Putty. This stuff is fantastic. I have no affiliation with Mr. Hobby. I kind of wish I did actually, but I don't. But this stuff, you just put it on with a brush or a cocktail stick or whatever you like. And it's fantastic for filling things like this, like seam lines and anything like that. And so you just put it on with a brush and leave it to dry. There's actually a great little trick for cleaning this stuff up, which I'll show you in a minute, which will save you so much work when it comes to filling gaps on models. So, and that is the use of isopropyl alcohol. Basically, let the putty dry for about 20 minutes, and then get a cocktail stick, or a cotton bud rather, sorry, with some isopropyl alcohol on it, and just rub it over the joint. And it basically removes all of the excess and kind of smooths out the filler, and leaves you with a perfect joint. It takes a bit of practice, but it's it works so well, and it will just make your life so much easier. I can't remember where I first saw this done, but if I remember who it was, I shall definitely give them credit, because it's a fantastic idea. But yes, great way to clean up this kind of putty. So yeah. And once that's all done, I'm just rescribing the panel lines using a JLC razor saw, which is a lovely bit of kit actually. It's I really probably really ought to change the blade on this one. As you can probably see, the blade on this is absolutely hammered, but it still does everything I want it to do. So you know, I think like most modelers, I'm quite frugal in certain regards, and it's like I'll change the blade when it's completely dead and not before. But yes, this is a great bit of kit for doing this sort of work. So yeah, that's that. And then something I forgot to do before I put the this section on, which was weight the nose. But fortunately, because this is going to be in flight, I'm going to put the cover over this anyway. So I'm just weighting the nose with a bit of with some fishing weights. So they'll go in, and then they'll get basically held in place with a little bit of white tack. It doesn't necessarily need a huge amount of weight, because this is going to be on a flight base, but it's basically just so that it doesn't tip over backwards. That's all I'm really doing with it. So yeah, a few fishing weights, bit of white tack. That's got the balance point a bit more in the middle, and then after thinning down the cover slightly to make it fit, I glue it in place, and that works just as well. Of course, what works even better is remembering to put the weights in before you seal up the front of the fuselage. So yeah, I don't know what I was doing when this happened, but for some reason I just completely forgot to put the. I had everything all there ready to go, and I just didn't do it for some reason. I don't know why, but anyway, these things happen. It's not the end of the world, as you can see. So that's all nicely done, and we can move on. And move on we shall to the engines, or at least parts of the engines. I'm actually going to do the internals of the engine and the nozzles, like the engine bells, metal or metallic. So I'm starting off with a gloss black primer to start with, to give a nice coat for the lacquer that we're going to use after this, so everything gets a nice quick whiz over with the gloss black. And then we move on to some All-Clad 2 airframe aluminium. Now, anybody who's watching in my videos knows that I'm a big fan of All-Clad lacquers. They give you a great finish. They're very easy to use. The only thing is they're a little bit stinky, and you do need to use cellulose thinner to clean them up, but that's not the end of the world. But yeah, so basically the various engine parts get a coat of the airframe aluminium, and once that's dry, for the internals, I'm actually going to give them a little bit of a going over with this gunmetal, and this is basically just to make it look a little bit burnt, you know, like there's some sort of heat scarring to it. So again, it's just a very, very light coat on the ends of the engine internals, just to you know, make it look like there's some heat going on in there. I mean, again, once this thing's together, you can barely see these, but I know it's there, so that's why I do it. So yeah, a little bit of that, and I think that's quite a nice little effect there. Yeah. And moving on with the assembly of the engines, I actually had a bit of trouble with this point, which was strange, because I'm sure I followed the instructions, but there's obviously there's 2 engines and 2 halves to each engine, and yet I had all kinds of trouble finding the halves that actually went together, which was very strange. I don't quite understand, because I'm sure I took them off the sprues according to the instructions, and yet the first one I tried to match them together and they didn't fit. And and so yeah, and I thought, oh well, it must be the other, you know. So I just had all kinds of problems. Anyway, got there in the end eventually, and got it together. It wasn't the end of the world, but it was just quite confusing, because I'm sure I took them off the frames the way I should have done. But yeah, anyway, after that all went together fairly well, so no real problem. The engines were actually one of the only not so great fitting parts of this, which you'll see later when I try and fit them on the wings. But yeah, speaking of which, this is fitting the lower wing into the fuselage. This was quite a tight fit, this part, which it made it a little bit awkward to get in, but it also meant there were no gaps or anything, which I was quite pleased about. I say for the most part, this actually went together quite well, this kit. I say the only thing I really had any trouble with was putting the engines on, which we'll see later. But the wings went on very nicely. I mean, this is just attaching the top parts of the wings. And it was quite nice because there were no sort of big gaps at the wing roots, which you quite often get on a lot of models. These actually went together surprisingly well. So, yeah, well done to that Airfix, but perhaps have a look at the fit of the engines. But anyway, that's beside the point. Putting the tail together, one of the things that surprised me actually with this, and it had nothing to do with the kit, but just the like the design of the aircraft, is how small that rudder is. It's absolutely tiny, you know, compared to the sort of the size of the aircraft. It's got this tiny little rudder on it, but I mean, obviously it worked, but it just seems very small. Anyway, that's beside the point. So once again, make sure the elevators are level, otherwise you'll hate yourself when you're finished. Get that all glued up and move on. So this is something else which I actually came to regret later. I actually didn't do a particularly good job of fitting the canopy. I realised only afterwards that I'd actually left a gap at the front, which you can actually see in the video, but I never noticed when I was doing it. And as a result, the canopy didn't actually fit exactly as it should. The whole thing needed to move forwards just a tiny amount, like 0.5 millimeter, but it was kind of annoying. But anyway, so this is fitting the engines, and as I mentioned earlier, it was a little problematic to get them on. They were I had to actually do a fair bit of trimming on the wing itself to get the engine to fit and even then the top of the engine didn't match up with the top of the wing very well, so I had to use quite a lot of filler in the end. But you can see there, when I move my fingers, there's quite a gap, like a step, which wasn't really very helpful. So yeah, again, it was a case of wheeling out the Mr. Dissolve putty, but you can see that you know, they just really don't fit, you know, all that well, which was, it's the only bits of this kit actually that didn't go together very well, was that. So a bit of a problem. Anyway, moving on to painting the fuselage, and for that we're using a mix of colours for this, because I went by, you know, just looking at various Imperial aircraft, and yes, they're grey, but they seem to have this kind of like bluey grey finish. So what I did was I went with a 50-50 mix of light sea grey and royal light grey, and that seemed to come up quite nicely as it goes. I mean, when I'm putting it on here, it just looks grey, but when it dries, it has a nice kind of like blue tint to it. So nice coat of that first of all, and then we move on to some more interesting effects to, again, make it not look like this, just a grey blob. So what I'm starting doing is with some ocean grey, so it's a slightly darker grey, and what I'm going to do is go lightly over the panel lines in a fairly haphazard fashion. I don't want this too uniform, so this is a very thin mix, and just very lightly go over the various panel lines, just to create some kind of low lights and shadows, which will create some tonal variation. So again, you can see I'm not being particularly precious about coverage. Some bits are more heavily covered than others, but that's fine because I don't want it looking too uniform. So yeah, go over the whole thing like this, and then once that's done and dry, then we're going to move on to our old favourite XF55 deck tan, and we're going to use this to highlight the panels. So a bit of mottling in the middle of the panels to again create some tonal variation and actually lighten up the middle of the panels. Again, just to get rid of that uniformity of the colour, because otherwise, as I've said before, it just looks like a grey blob. So the reason I do this in this fashion is so that if any of the panel lines and etc. are too dark, I can actually go over them and blend them in using the deck tan. So yeah, just a case of highlighting all the various panels, and once that's done, then we can go back to our grey mix, because as you can see, this looks a little odd like this. So we go back to our grey mix, a thinned down version of our grey mix, and use that to blend everything together, to give it a nice sort of, well, just a little bit more of a uniform finish. So, but again, without being too uniform, if that makes sense. But just go over it lightly until you get the effect that you want. One thing to bear in mind when you're doing this is that the colours will show through more once the colour coat is dry. So it's worth stopping now and again, letting it dry, or hitting it with a hairdryer for a few minutes, and then checking it again. Anyway, once that's all done and dry and you're happy with it, give it a coat of clear varnish, and we can move on to decals, which as usual we will use our Mr. Mark softer and setter to put the decals on. Now I'm going to be using some of these the stencils from the kit, not the unit markings, but the just the stencils, and I have actually printed some Imperial insignia logos to go on. So the some of them have a nice white background, and I was really pleased with how well these came out as it goes, because I think I've probably mentioned before, my printer is not great, and so I was very pleased with how well these decals actually came out. They actually look, well, pardon me blowing my own trumpet, they actually look pretty good. So and they go on just like regular decals. The only difference being with these ones, because they're a white paper, you have to cut them out right along the line so you don't end up with a white border. So they're a little bit tricky to cut out, but just take your time, use a decent pair of scissors, and they come out looking really nicely. And these decals, they're really thin as well, and they conform to the model very, very well. It's only cheap paper from eBay, but it works really well. So yeah, I'm very pleased with that. So these are the ones for the wings. These are slightly smaller. I basically just measured the largest dimensions of the kit decals and then scaled the these images accordingly using Paint Shop Pro, which is, I have a copy that's positively ancient Paint Shop Pro, but it does what I want it to do, and printed them out. And on the tops of the wings, these ones have a clear background. I would have really liked to have printed this one white, but that would have been an absolute nightmare to cut out, because I would have had to have printed basically an outline on the white paper and then cut out all of the rest of it, and it really just would have been an absolute nightmare. So that's why I chose to go for the black on a clear background. But I don't know, it looks good. And then some of the kit decals, as I mentioned, the stencils, I didn't use all of them, I just used a few, because I always think at this kind of scale, if you put them all on, it starts to look a bit busy and a bit messy. So I just put some of the more obvious ones on, like the ones on the engines, and I put a couple on the fuselage, but I didn't put all of them on, just enough to give it a little bit of variation. But you can see there that big gap at the front of the canopy. I was really annoyed about that. I actually tried to get the canopy off again, but I couldn't get it off. So otherwise I would have took it off and done it again. Anyway, that's beside the point. Another coat of clear varnish once all the decals are done, and I decided at that point that I couldn't live with that canopy looking the way it did with that big obvious gap. So what I decided to do was something that I had thought about doing previously, was adding some black to the design, because obviously TIE fighters have some fairly large black bits, and I thought, again, to kind of go with a hybrid colour scheme, I decided that something that's done on a lot of jet fighters is they have a black strip in front of the canopy to basically reduce glare off the front of the aircraft into the pilot's eyes. So they have like a matte black strip along the front of the aircraft. So I decided to mask it up a bit and paint a black highlight, if you like, onto the top of the canopy and the front of the fuselage. So, but again, I didn't want just plain black, so I'm actually going to mottle it with our old favourite, the deck tan. This is something I'm actually doing as well, because I need practice with this, because it's a good way of painting black and again making it not look too uniform. And so mottling this this black works very well, and I've actually got some projects coming up in the future where there's going to be a lot of black involved, and so anytime I get a chance to practice mottling black, that's what I do. So that's that, and then again a very thin down coat of the black over the top of it, just very lightly over the top, and it actually gives it a nice sort of tonal variation. And once that's done, give the whole thing a whiz of some matte varnish to seal it all off, and then last but by no means least, take off the canopy mask. So this actually, it was quite cool to take this off and see our old friend Mr. Vader sitting in there. Yeah, very pleased with how that came out. So yeah, let's wrap this up. And here is the finished article. I'm really very pleased how this came out, the canopy debacle notwithstanding. I think this looks pretty good. I'm very pleased with the overall colour scheme of it. It's nice and grey, but without looking too uniform and monochromatic. There's a nice lot of tonal variation in there while maintaining what looks like a clean and well-maintained aircraft, or spacecraft as the case may be. So yeah, very pleased with this. So this will be going on to a diorama in the near future with the Tomahawk and there's a few extra bits that I'm going to do, which you'll see in an upcoming video. But hopefully this has been of interest to some of you. I know it's something a lot of people have been quite interested in. So yeah, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Cheers. Bye.